Thank you for joining us today in our webinar, Putting the Spotlight on the Hidden Crime of Elder Abuse. I'm the Reverend Laura Queen, and I've been with the Church Pension Group for the last 12 years to provide member educational opportunities. June is Elder Abuse Awareness Month, and June 15th is World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. It is an international United Nations observance day that is recognized each year. In 2018, the Church Pension Group began a concerted effort to educate all our members about financial fraud prevention. And that's where I had the honor to meet the Honorable Paul Greenwood, Deputy Attorney who is retired from San Diego County. And it's an honor for me to introduce and invite Paul to join me today. Hi, Paul, welcome.
Well, thank you, Laura, and thank you, everybody, for joining us for today's webinar. And let me just put this up here. Hopefully you can all see that. And it is appropriate that we spend this hour together reflecting on what is called a hidden crime from so many people. And I'm hoping that all of us can be part of the solution. So I call myself a former deputy district attorney, a prosecutor from San Diego County here in California. And for 22 years, I was fortunate enough to lead the Elder Abuse Prosecution Unit in the DA's office there. And one thing that became very clear to me was that as a crime, elder abuse is very much hidden. And the focus that I have for today, and it has been for so many years, is what can we do collectively as a community and as a body of believers do to help put this insidious crime more into the spotlight. The question I always ask audiences wherever I am says, who needs to be involved? Is it just prosecutors? Is it just police officers? Is it just adult protective services? And I believe, based upon what I learned in the courtroom of prosecuting these kind of crimes for 22 years, it takes all of us. It takes the mail carrier, the Meals on Wheels. It takes a retired clergy. It takes a pastor of a church. It takes the ER nurse. It takes the next door neighbor. It takes the hairdresser. Everyone has a responsibility for looking out for their neighbor. And to get scriptural for a minute, because I am also a believer, isn't it interesting that Jesus talked about two groups of people that we need to really prioritize? And he talked about the widows and he talked about orphans. And it is no coincidence that about 70% of all my victims were widows. I like this graphic from Hawaii. I hope there's one or two people from Hawaii on this call today, because it reminds me that when we are synchronized, it's amazing the progress we can make. It takes all of us to work together to move forward. So a little just more about my background. As you can probably tell, even though I live and have worked in San Diego for many, many years, I'm not exactly your classic Southern California dude. I'm originally from the UK, in fact, from Sussex, and I was a lawyer in England for 13 years. Started life as a barrister, but wearing that white wig and the black gown did not suit me, so I became a general practitioner called a solicitor. So how on earth would a solicitor in England end up as a San Diego prosecutor? Meet my wife. This is Sue. We will be celebrating our 45th wedding anniversary later this summer. And I had the good fortune to literally walk into a Baptist church in San Diego in August of 1973. I just graduated from law school in England. I was traveling around America. I was about to embark upon a 2-year assignment as a teacher in Kenya. And I walk into a Baptist church in San Diego, and the only empty seat was sitting next to this gorgeous young lady. Found out that 3 weeks from then, she was coming to England, where she was going to attend a Bible school called Capernwray. And I knew that school. And because I had a few months before I was going to go to Kenya, I said, I'll meet you. But little did I know that God had it planned that we would actually fly back to England on the very same day, 3 weeks later, from New York. And our flights were leaving 10 minutes apart. So that began a relationship that has never been extinguished. So she's the love of my life. And as I say, we've been married for almost 45 years. We left the UK in 1991 after living there for so many years through some serious health problems that my wife had, through the loss of our second child, Sarah. We decided that it was appropriate to bring my wife back to her hometown. So we left England in 1991 with a 10-year-old daughter and a 4-year-old son. I was jobless, unqualified, and so I had to sit for the dreaded California bar exam. Thankfully, because I had been a lawyer, I knew probably enough to convince the bar examiners that I actually knew more than I really did, and they gave me a pass. So I joined a civil law firm for 2 years, but then 2 years later, I got my big break. The district attorney's office was hiring, and I think I was probably the very first person that ran down to the courthouse to put in my application. I was fortunate to be hired. I was the very first non-citizen prosecutor that they'd ever hired. Since then, of course, I had become a proud citizen, but at the time I was a green card holder, but they hired me in any event. And I spent 25 amazing years at that prosecutor's office. Why then would I decide to leave? I looked at the number. 25 was a good number, I thought, to leave on. I also looked at my age. Back in 2018, I was 66. I'm 71 now. And I realized that things were changing. And I think the best way I can describe how things change in your 60s is by showing you what happens over a 40-year period. If you look at the left-hand column, compare it to the right-hand column, I think you'll get the drift of what I'm talking about. Things change over time. Also, my late father gave me some good advice. He said, Paul, always leave something before they want you to. Very good advice. This number also impacted my decision to leave. No, this is not my county pension. This was a headline that was cropping up in early 2018. And this is what it refers to. And just absorb that for a minute, would you? I was getting in January and February of 2018 more and more calls from all over the country. And they were very similar in content. They were saying to me, Mr. Greenwood, we are seeing a huge increase in the number of calls of suspected elder abuse and financial abuse. Would you be able to come to our jurisdiction and help energize our local law enforcement, energize our local prosecutors and get them involved? And I realized if I was going to do that, then my day job would suffer. And I felt that the time had come for me to spread my wings a little bit and share the information that I've learned in the courtroom over 22 years of prosecuting these cases with a wider audience. And today is a perfect example of that. This number also impacted my decision to leave because 5 years ago, I literally had a conversation with my wife. What is the best gift I can give you for 40 years of marriage? And you know what she said? More of you, more of your time. Now, little did we know that COVID was coming. Boy, have we spent more time together. It's been wonderful. So my journey began in January of 1996 into this whole arena called elder abuse. I'd been in the office 3 years. I was called into the boss's office, and I could tell he was upset. He sat me down. He said, Greenwood, I've had a very troubling phone call from Adult Protective Services. And I said immediately, who are they? He said, I don't know, but I know that they're upset. I said, what about? He said, apparently our office is ignoring a huge escalating crime called elder abuse. I said, what's that? He said, I don't know, but you're about to find out because I've just named you as the first head of the first ever elder abuse prosecution unit. And that is exactly how it turned out. And this became my assignment for the next 22 years. Very rare for any prosecutor in this country to spend 22 years devoted to one type of crime only. And I've been asked many times, why did you stick at it for so long? And it's a very easy response. In fact, there are two reasons. and this is who they are. This is a photo of my late parents. And sadly, my dad, at the age of 92, passed away from advanced Alzheimer's. He was diagnosed at the age of 79. But I don't think of my dad primarily as an Alzheimer's victim. You know how I think of my dad? As this. Because when I was about 7, I discovered something very special about my dad. He had been a bomber pilot in World War II, a true hero. He survived 79 missions, and on 78 of them landed perfectly. But on mission number 4, which happened to be on June the 4th, 1944, he was engaged by enemy aircraft, shot down over the Adriatic, plummeted 50 feet below the surface of the Adriatic, and was almost drowned, but thankfully was rescued by Yugoslav fishermen. And you know, there's my mom, who was an English high school teacher for many, many years. She passed away at age 96. My mom enjoyed the fine things of life, was never seen without pearls or beads around her neck, and loved flowers. She was a baker. She loved to bake scones, but she was a brilliant communicator. And one more thing, she was a lay preacher. Her own father was a preacher in London during the war. He became what was known as the secretary to the London City Mission. But my mom was one of the very first female preachers in the 1950s and 1960s in the UK. And so I'm one of these people that happens to believe that they represent our finest generation. And I would be remiss if I didn't pause for a moment and say, let us not forget what today is. And I'm sure many of you have remembered it already. It is the anniversary of D-Day. We lost many, many heroes on that day, but we are thankful for them, each and every one of them. So my journey into this whole journey, as I said, of elder abuse began in January 96. They gave me everything a prosecutor could ever need, right? Except one thing. Nobody was bringing me any cases. And if you know how a district attorney's office works, we rely on law enforcement to bring us cases, robberies, drugs, burglaries. But you know what? Nobody was bringing me anything from law enforcement for elder abuse. All I had to deal with was silence. And this poster became my motivating factor and still is today. And I always ask myself this question: what can I do today to break through the barrier of silence? And I'm going to ask you the same question. What can you be doing in your community right now to help break through this barrier? Because there is so much silence out there in every community. Canada said it well. They said elder abuse thrives on silence. The Attorney General for Kansas has called elder abuse the silent epidemic of our time. So you understand one of the major problems is silence, particularly from the victims. And what did I learn during this journey? I learned very quickly that it's a crime that was going unpunished, but it's very predictable. I also learned that elder abuse as a crime was where domestic violence and child abuse were 40 or 50 years ago. And I also learned that it's escalating. Do you know how many people turn 65 in one day in America? In one day, 10,000 people. And we're all living longer. Many of you on this webinar will live to be 100. And I don't know if you've ever thought about what is the secret to living to be 100. Well, there's several, but there's one secret that you may not be aware of: eating Smuckers for breakfast. Oh yeah, apparently this is it, the secret solution. And Beatrice, 106, Belen, 104. But my favorite centenarian is this lady. Now, I'm not endorsing it, but I'm just telling you it's a true story. She lived to be 103. And yet, despite what is the obvious escalation in this aging population, here's the blunt truth. This is what we spend as a country on elder justice prevention issues compared to other child and family welfare issues. Now, I'm not suggesting we reduce the budget for child and family welfare. No, not at all. But we should certainly increase the budget to protect older adults. Now, before I get into some of my tips, the number one suspect in your community for committing acts of violence against an older adult is this guy. He's a son. How do I know it? Because I have prosecuted so many of these sons. Tragically, I've prosecuted several of them for committing murder against their own mothers. But there is a consistency in what I have seen over these many, many years. And this is who he is. This is his age group, living at home, typically with a widowed mother. He's either divorced, come back, single, never left, or just got released from jail. And in almost every single case that I prosecuted, he's lazy and unemployed. Whenever I would talk to his mother, I would say to her, I noticed that your 46-year-old son is living with you, but he's not working. Why? And she would tell me, Mr. Greenwood, he tells me he has a medical condition. I say, let me guess, he's got a bad back. And she says, how did you know? I said, well, it comes from sitting in your sofa 8 hours a day playing video games. Now, okay, accuse me of being a little cynical. Yeah, it's true. I am cynical, but I'm also basing it upon fact after fact. And these sons, many of them have an addiction. It's either meth, vodka and or beer, or frequenting the casino. And because those addictions cost money, where does he get it from? He gets it from stealing from his mother. You know what he steals first? Her jewelry. And he pawns it. He then steals her debit card. He steals her pension check, forges the signature, so on it goes on. Sometimes some of these sons have an untreated history of mental illness, maybe bipolar, schizophrenia. The mother has tried her hardest to get help for him, but he refuses to take the meds or drops off from a program, and he ends up acting out. I've prosecuted those cases too. I think those cases require a different approach. They don't require punishment, they require treatment. I think it's also very important that we educate ourselves about how older adults are being exploited. And education is a big part of my campaign, and I'm so glad that you as a group have identified that awareness training is so important. Please pass on any of this information to your neighbors, to your congregation. If you'd like me to do a webinar for your wider congregation, let me know. I'd be more than happy to arrange something with you because it's so essential. If only more people would be forearmed with this information, that $37 billion that I told you about and showed you the headline of earlier on in the presentation would diminish rapidly. And this education extends not just to our families, to our friends, it goes beyond that, to police departments, to hospitals, to libraries, social workers, to mail carriers. Everybody needs to get educated about this. And there are lots of resources, and I'm so glad that you're going to be putting resources into the chat box. But I just want to show you one classic good resource. You type in the United States Senate Special Committee on Aging, where I had the privilege of testifying 3 times during my career in Washington. Fighting fraud. They give you current scams. And as you look at this list of scams, I'm sure you will recognize some of them. In fact, you may have even had a call this morning from one of these scammers about one of these scams. But we need to know how these work, because it could be that next week or next month, one of your own loved ones in your own extended family might become a victim of one of these. And if you believe the headlines, then I think you will agree with me, we are in for a challenge. So these are some of the typical headlines out there. It's being called a virtual pandemic. It's on the rise. Advocates fear that it's on the rise. And we've had a substantial escalation in these cases since COVID because of isolation. So you get the drift. There is indeed a whole rapid increase in the number of cases. And just when you think you can trust somebody in your community, from time to time, I'm going to show you cases that I've been involved in. Here's one of them. So here you've got a Chase Bank employee in San Diego County who, instead of protecting older adults' monies, what is she doing? She's actually stealing it for herself. And she steals over $300,000 from her elderly clients. So what I want to do now is share with you some of my tips that I've learned from prosecuting cases. And if we could adapt and adopt some of these tips, I'm convinced that we could actually prevent a lot of these frauds from occurring. And again, I would welcome and encourage you to put questions into the Q&A box, wherever you put it in the chat box, whatever it is. Please ask questions. We can look through those, and if there's not time this morning, we'll get to those questions at a later time. But I think it's very important that we do that. Okay, so 65% of all the cases, and I prosecuted in excess of 750 felony cases, ranging from homicide, sexual assault, neglect, false imprisonment, emotional abuse, and financial exploitation. And at least 65% of all those cases involve some form of financial exploitation. In fact, some of them had a combination. So on some of the homicide cases that I prosecuted, the older adult who was murdered was actually a victim of financial exploitation prior to their death. That's why it's very important that we try to red flag these cases prior to anything worse happening to the victim. And it's interesting that the CDC, of which we've heard so much about in the last 3.5 years, has now called exploitation of the elderly a public health concern, with good reason. And I don't think it's overdramatic to say we are going to see an explosion of these cases. And I like this graphic because it reminds me of some of the hands upon which we have placed handcuffs. And you might be surprised at the type of people that I've prosecuted over my career. I've prosecuted realtors, lots of caregivers, sons. I've prosecuted lawyers, prosecuted bookkeepers. I've prosecuted a choir director in a Methodist church. So there's a whole variety of different folks who take advantage. We should never assume that just because somebody has a particular rank or position or job, that it makes them immune from being a potential suspect. So here are some of the tips, and I will get through these fairly quickly. Many of us are dealing with elderly parents. After this webinar is over, my wife and I will be attending to my wife's 93-year-old mother, who is legally blind, is a full risk, who doesn't want to go into a nursing home, and is insisting on staying in her own home. She's a widow. And so thankfully, my wife has 4 siblings. And so between them, we take a day each to take care of elderly mother. It's something which a lot of us are having to deal with, and some of us are going to have to, at some point, hire a caregiver. When you do that, it's one of the most important decisions you will ever make. Never hire through Craigslist, never hire through a newspaper, always go through an agency. And I've got people who always push back on me and say, Mr. Greenwood, you don't understand. They're so expensive. Oh, I understand that. If we shortcut and go and hire somebody off the streets, basically, without a proper agency behind them, financially, it could be the worst decision we ever made. And I always say, when you go to an agency, interview them, ask them, what kind of background check do you do? Do you just do a local background check? Do you do a state background check? Or do you do a countrywide background check? And I say, you can consider hiring your own private investigator. Why am I putting a lot of importance on this? Because so many of my defendants were caregivers. And why were they? Because it was easy for them to steal jewelry, easily converted into cash. There was this assumption by a lot of caregivers, some of whom were battling with drug addiction, some of whom had criminal records. Many of them actually had criminal records. One of them actually had a conviction for killing a previous client. there's an assumption amongst a lot of these caregivers, well, I can steal because they won't find out or they won't, quote, press charges. And they always seem to have a justification for why they needed the extra money. Now take this gal in the middle. She stole almost $600,000 from the man on the left. That man on the left, we've never found his body. We don't know when, where, or how she murdered him, but she murdered him. And the jury agreed, even though we couldn't produce a body, they convicted her not only of elder exploitation, of first-degree murder. This gentleman on the left, this was taken on his 98th birthday. I prosecuted his caregiver for murder. He lived in a mobile home park, and after his wife died, and he was married for 72 years, and he had a disability. He'd lost his right hand in an industrial accident when he was 23. So he needed a caregiver. And so he put an ad in the newspaper. Julie Spencer replied, and she started stealing from him. He found out. He was going to call the cops, but she told him, if you do that, they will take me away, but they'll also take you away and put you in a nursing home. He believed her. And he decided to keep her on, which was a fatal mistake, because 6 weeks later she attacked him, and 8 weeks after that, he died. Talk about heroes. Look at this hero, a Pearl Harbor survivor who was isolated by his caregiver. The neighbors got worried. They called for APS. They called in the sheriff. The sheriff found my victim laying in filth in the kitchen. How did she isolate her victim? The caregiver put notices like this in the windows, deterring visitors. And in the back bedroom, the sheriff found all the cash that she'd been stealing from my victim's bank account. One of the very first cases I prosecuted was a caregiver out of Nevada. She was a professional crook. The caregiver agency didn't do a background check on her. She came and she was hired immediately, and she stole from my elderly victim. Thankfully, the daughter made an unannounced visit. Tip number 2. The number one item that is stolen from older adults is jewelry. Now, who steals the jewelry? Well, I've given you a couple of hints. The son, the caregiver, but also the person who's in your home doing a job. I've prosecuted carpet cleaners. One carpet cleaner stuck his high-powered vacuum into the jewelry drawer and sucked the jewelry down the pipe into his truck. I've prosecuted the termite fumigator who has gone in when the homeowners are vacant, outside or gone, and he steals the jewelry. I've all kinds of people. So keep it in a locked drawer. Keep photos of sentimental or valuable items. Do you see all these 7 victims? I prosecuted their predator. He was the maintenance guy in their assisted living facility. And whenever they had a problem in their apartments, he would come in, ask them to leave because he was going to get noisy and dusty. They would go have coffee while he was stealing their jewelry because they didn't lock it up. Shred everything, because unfortunately, if we don't shred everything that has information about ourselves, guess what? The dumpster diver in your community will find it and will use that information against us. Please protect incoming and outgoing mail. I think unlocked mailboxes should be outlawed. I really do. It's an open invitation to crooks. And I think whoever invented that red flag, I think it was probably invented by a crook, because that's the only people who really get to benefit from it. Right now in your community, there are crooks driving around looking for unlocked mailboxes, or they're looking for the Amazon delivery guy who's dropping off a parcel on the porch. So not only do we have thieves who steal from mailboxes, we have thieves who are now called porch pirates. And so I always say to people who are mobile, consider renting a PO box. And then one more thing, if you're going to ever use a new checkbook, and a lot of people, when I talk about checks, they go, excuse me, what's a check? But if there are people, and I still use checks occasionally, next time you order a checkbook, if you do a couple of things for me. Number one, tell your bank or credit union, only put my first initial and my last name on the check. Don't put anything else. No address, no full name, nothing. Secondly, always collect your checkbox from the bank or the credit union. Don't trust it to the mail, because sometimes they get lost in the mail and get stolen. So there's my message for mobile people: rent a PO box. What about credit searches? Now, some of us sign up for credit protection agencies, and they're okay. Nothing wrong with that, but they're not 100%. But definitely, in addition, we should do credit searches on ourselves. And we need to talk to your financial institution about how you do that. There's a website called annualcreditreport.com that you can go on safely and actually do your own credit search. Why is that important? It's important to make sure that nobody has applied for a credit card in your name. And that happens a lot. It happened to me. I'm a victim of identity theft. I've even had my taxes filed on my behalf by the crook. So consider freezing your credit. That is one protection that is available to us all. It's not a permanent thing. You can unfreeze it. You can thaw it out. It takes about 72 hours to unfreeze your credit, but it is a method that we can use. If you don't think you're going to need a new credit card, or you don't need a new car loan or a mortgage, consider freezing your credit. Every home should have caller ID. Again, don't rely on it exclusively, because there is such things as spoofing, where the crooks can mimic real phone numbers. I always tell people, if you get a phone call from somebody's number that you don't recognize, don't be afraid to let it go to message. Why are we people of curiosity? Why are we always drawn to picking up the phone? It's just something out of human nature. Let's go to message. If it's real, they'll leave a message and a callback number. If it's a scam, they'll probably just move on to the next one. So remember, crooks do mimic real phone numbers. They'll even mimic your local police department. I've had one victim in the last few months from Hawaii who believed that her local police station was calling her, but it wasn't. It was the crook calling her. And what do you do with those annoying phone calls that keep coming in? I always say, well, if you pick up the phone, then blow a whistle down the phone. That's a good deterrent. It's also a good means of exercising your diaphragm. And what about these robocalls that you get on your cell phones? I use an app called RoboKiller, which blocks a lot of different calls, which I think is very, very good. This is going to ruin your Tuesday afternoon, wherever you are. You'll never win the foreign lottery. Sorry about that. Please don't ever believe the guy on the phone, the guy through emails or letters. It's fake. Unless somebody's going to be on the doorstep with a camera and balloons, it ain't going to happen. You'll never, ever get that silver Mercedes that is being promised to you. But unfortunately, every day in America, somebody falls victim to the lottery scam. As an example, talk about retired clergy. I got this email from a retired Catholic priest, and he became the victim of the Publishers Clearinghouse scam. He really believed that he had won over $1.6 million. And so he sent $41,000. He thought he was paying the taxes on $1.6 million. But he was actually wiring the money to this guy. This is the crook. This is a picture from the bank in Greenville, South Carolina. But he opened the account with a fraudulent name and with a fraudulent social security number. So we didn't really know who he was, other than we knew what he looked like. So what did? We sent his picture, this picture, to every law enforcement agency within a 50-mile radius. And within 2 weeks, a detective recognized it and sent us back a booking photo of the suspect. And we had his true name. And so we extradited him from the East Coast. What if one of your parishioners gets this letter? Immediately, you can tell that this is a forgery. This is a fake. It's a fraud. Number one, the IRS will never tell you and me that we've won $950,000, right? I mean, the IRS doesn't operate that way. Secondly, crooks do not know how to spell. So look on line 3 at the top there. You'll see that they don't even know how to spell lottery. So that's a huge red flag. But people, unfortunately, believe this is to be true. How do you know that this envelope is fraudulent? Well, you look at the address on the left, Chicago, okay, and then you look over to the right. And you can tell this never came from Chicago. This came from a French-speaking province in Canada, otherwise known as Quebec. This came from Montreal, which is actually the #1 boiler room in the North America for frauds and scams. Inside was a letter, purportedly from Pepsi, congratulating my victim that she was the next winner of the $1 million. And inside that letter was a check from virtual Las Vegas. Now, would you ever trust a check from virtual Las Vegas? I hope not, but she did. She cashed it. She was told by the crook on the phone, don't tell the bank you've won $1 million. And when you've deposited $5,400, withdraw $3,600 so you can then give it to us via MoneyGram for the taxes. And 24 hours later, my victim was called up by the bank and told, this is a fraudulent check. We're freezing your account. And by the way, you owe us $3,600. Tip number 8, the IRS will never call you. And just in case you didn't hear me, they'll never call you. And just in case you didn't hear me, they'll never call you. Okay, so you have to repeat that to people. The IRS will never, ever call. On a similar vein, your grandson will never call you from jail. Although sometimes I will say, if he does, let him stay there. But you get the understanding of this one. Don't allow any of your friends, family, community to believe that the grandson is calling from jail. Because we call it the grandma scam. And the caller will convince the grandmother that he's in jail, he needs bail money. And he'll either ask for you to buy prepaid debit cards such as MoneyPack, or surprisingly enough, iTunes gift cards, or even department store, Target gift cards. And just when we thought it was bad enough, now we have artificial intelligence to combat. Have you seen the headlines? Just 2 weeks ago, the co-founder of Apple, Steve Wozniak, has warned that it may get even harder to detect when something is a scam. And even they call the godfather of artificial intelligence is afraid of how AI is going to be used for criminal purposes, and doesn't want to be associated anymore with the invention that he helped create. It's almost like he's built a train which is now on runaway tracks, and he's afraid of that. So what's happening? Already, we're seeing artificial intelligence being used to mimic voices or to grab recorded snippets of somebody's voice and then expanding that same voice to include other vocabulary. So we're seeing examples already cropping up all over the country of family emergency calls where the caller absolutely believes that they are talking to their real family relative. It's so clear. And yet it's all a scam. So we've got to warn people that when you get calls and you absolutely believe it's coming from your grandson, do not believe that. The first thing you need to do is check with your own family. Call your family. Even though somebody's telling you don't call anybody, you call your family. Tip number 10. Don't look for love in all the wrong places. The romance scam is probably at the top of the list of the top 10 scams. And there are two major types of this scam. There's what we call the face-to-face con artist artist scam. In fact, yesterday I had to drive to Los Angeles, where I was testifying as an expert witness in a criminal prosecution brought by the federal government, U.S. Attorney's Office, against a suspect who had kidnapped this elderly woman and kept her in his car. And he'd been stealing her money, and all on what appeared to be a romantic relationship between him and this elderly woman. He was 15 years younger than her. And these con artists seek out their victims in various places. Do you know where they find them? Parking lots. Where? Particularly Walmart. Places of faith. I'm afraid to tell you, and I'm sure you know already, that within the worship sanctuaries that you are a part of, there are predators lurking, looking for the perfect victim. There are others, predators knocking on doors, looking for the perfect victim. There are those hanging out at casinos and at grocery stores, looking for the lonely individual. And then there's a second type of predator online. I like this slide, because there are so many of these crooks working from within prison walls. It's so easy to smuggle a cell phone into a prison these days. And how do they spend their time? Operating the romance scam from within the prison. Listen to this lady.
I look at it now and I think, how could I be so naive?
This woman is still healing after losing hundreds of thousands of dollars in a scam, and has asked us not to use her name. The 79-year-old ballroom dance executive says it happened after she decided to use an online dating service.
He was calling all the time. Almost every day he would call to see how I was. He also realized how musical I was or am, and that I enjoyed dancing. So he would send a lot of music videos.
They decided to meet, but the man who said he was a general contractor abruptly needed to go to Malaysia for work. At one point, he said he needed money for a construction license.
The answers were always legitimate in my mind, and so I sent him the first $9,000.
Over several weeks, she sent more money. In all,
Well, she sent in all $400,000 to the person that she'd never met. Talking about meeting, I'd like you to meet Kate Kleinert. Kate, I met several months ago. She now works for AARP, as I do. And the reason she does is because she's a spokesperson for them now. And she goes around the country telling her story. She lost all her life savings to somebody she's never met. She's articulate. She works for a Catholic charity. And she never believed that she could fall victim to anything like this. But she did, because her heart overruled her brain. And not only did she lose her life savings, she lives in Pennsylvania. Last summer, during a heat wave, because she had no money left, when her air conditioning unit broke down, she didn't have any money to call in the repair technician. So she went out to her local store and bought the cheapest plug-in unit she could find. And a few days later, that caught fire. And as a result, her whole house burned down. And tragically, in it, all 6 hospice dogs that she was caring for perished. So often these fraud stories have ripple effects that know no bounds. So Kate is a perfect example of where articulate, intelligent people without impairment can become victims. And then some victims can become what we call money mules, where they get persuaded by the suspects, by the crooks, to pass on money to other people. And that makes them to become part of a criminal enterprise and subject to potential prosecution. So we need to warn victims that if they continue to dabble, they could end up becoming defendants. I want you to meet a second person, Glenda Syme. She's 81, from Missouri. And she was sentenced to 5 years federal probation last month because she was warned so many times and yet failed to heed those warnings and kept sending money to other people, and as a result was prosecuted by the feds, 81 years of age. Okay, tip number 11. Don't assume that the friendly handyman is licensed. You know, often we need repairs done on our homes, roofing repairs, driveway repairs, porch repairs. And I always say, always check with your Better Business Bureau, always check with your state agency. In California, it's called the Contractor State License Board. Make sure that the handyman is licensed by your state, not just with a local city code number, but by your state. And I always tell people, get free estimates. Don't pay more than 10% or $1,000, whichever is less. So on a $4,000 roof repair, only pay $400. Insist on a written contract. Where possible, pay by check, and always keep a documented history of the job so that if the contractor abandons the project, you have proof. One of my favorite cases involved this guy. He called himself Father and Daughter's Christian Construction Company. Where do you think he left this flyer? On windshields in a busy church parking lot in my hometown of Escondido. And it was all a fraud. He was not licensed, he was not bonded, he was not insured, but he was able to get victims. And this is an example of his contracts. And again, as I said before, one of the red flags of being a crook is they don't know how to spell. This is full of spelling mistakes. He got my victim to write out a check for $1,300. She thought that was the full price, but then he came back several hours later and demanded another check for $4,200. It was a total ripoff. One of the very last cases I completed was this one. Have you ever had something go wrong with your garage door? It's very frustrating. You're in an emergency situation, you feel trapped. So you call the first person you read about in the yellow pages, if there is still such a thing. And this company out of Dallas, Texas, which operates in almost every single state in the country, trained their technicians to oversell to unsuspecting elderly homeowners. They called themselves Neighborhood Garage Door Services, which gave the San Diego homeowners a false belief that they were dealing with a local company, and they weren't. They were dealing with a Texas company who were training crooked technicians. And we finally caught one, and he ultimately pled guilty. What if somebody calls you and says there's a virus on your computer? What should you do? You should hang up or blow the whistle down the phone before you hang up. Because what they'll do is they'll try to convince you to download software and then give them the code, and then they will be able to hijack the computer. And when they do that, they'll be able to steal all the information from your computer. These guys operate all over the world, and they are trying to get into everyone's computer who is unsuspecting. They'll use Microsoft as their sort of means for getting a permission to operate your computer. Tip number 13, always have a second line of defense at your front door, meaning a grill door, security door, a peephole. Don't allow anybody in, even if they're in uniform, unless you are expecting them, unless you orchestrated the appointment. If somebody stands there outside in a uniform saying they're from the water company, don't let them in. Always call the water company. You see these 4 people? These were all victims of mine. They were all victims of what I call the Roto-Rooter defendant. Now, by the way, this is not the real crook. This is just some poor fellow I borrowed from Roto-Rooter's website. But the crook used to work for Roto-Rooter, but they fired him for dishonesty, but they didn't get his uniform back. So one day, he goes to this senior complex in one part of San Diego County, and he knocks on the door of every independent living apartment, wearing his plumbing uniform. And you know what he says? Management has sent me. There's a problem with your plumbing. I need to come in and check. Oh, because he said management has sent me, they believed him. And so every single one of these victims let him in. And then he directs them to go to the rear bathroom, to stand by the taps, turn on the hot and cold taps when directed. Meanwhile, he's out of sight in the living area, stealing small, valuable items. This lady, one of the most courageous, bravest victims I've ever dealt with. She was the victim of the Kirby vacuum cleaner salesman. Don't ever allow anybody in your family to buy a Kirby. Have you ever tried picking one up? They are so heavy, and they work on a home sale basis. This lady bought a Kirby. 6 weeks later, the salesman knocked on her door at 10 o'clock at night and said, "Hi, Sandy, remember me? Would you believe it? My girlfriend has just dumped me. She's just finished the relationship, and she pushed me out of the car in your street, and I don't have any way of getting home. Could I come in and use your telephone to call my mom?" Without hesitation, Sandy let him in. 10 o'clock at night. You know what he did? He grabbed her around the neck, squeezed her so tight that she blacked out. When she woke up, she could not move. He had duct taped her from foot to head. He then slid her through the house into her garage, threw her into the trunk of her car, and kept her prisoner for 26 and a half hours while he drove around and stole things and tortured her, because every time she tried to call out, he would stop the car and beat her. Thankfully, he's now serving a life sentence for torture. And what if somebody stopped you in your front garden and said, "Hi, I'm with the FBI. Here's my badge and here's my business card"? Would you believe it? My victim did. But this is a crook. This is what crooks do. They will use fake badges and fake business cards, convincing my victim that her bank account was being tapped into by a bank teller. He was investigating it, but he needed my victim to go to the bank and withdraw all her money. And then he would meet her back the next morning at her house to count out the money and put invisible FBI ink on the notes. Thankfully, before he arrived, my victim called the San Diego Police Department, who came over and realized that this was a fraud. And thankfully, the crook showed up and was arrested. And after he was arrested, we did a search warrant on his house and we found a script. This is what the crook did. He wrote down, "We're with the FBI, flash the badge." Now, this is a big tip, that when you go shopping tomorrow at Whole Foods or Trader Joe's or your local supermarket, particularly ladies, please do not leave your purse in your shopping cart. Now, take this for example. I hope it works. I think it will. Watch this lady in the bottom foreground. She's picking apples. The crooks are working in a pair. The one is in a hat. It's coming around the corner here, and the other one, it comes up to the victim. Now, watch the cart in the bottom of the slide. Watch the crook unzip the purse and remove the wallet and leave. Don't do that. Don't put your purse in the don't put your purse in the cart. Whenever my wife and I go shopping, I see this every time at Costco, at Trader Joe's, at Whole Foods, at Sprouts. And I always go up to the customer and say, "Excuse me, ma'am, forgive me for telling you this, but you are at risk of having your wallet stolen." And she'll go, "What?" I say, "Because this is what's going on in every supermarket in the country. There are crooks looking for ways to steal your wallet. And by the time you get to the checkout, which could be 15 minutes later, that's when you discover it missing. By that time, the crook has already used your credit card at the gas pump and in Target to purchase $750 worth of equipment." Okay, I've only got 4 more tips left, and then we'll have a little discussion, hopefully, before we wrap it up. So tip number 15, somebody approaches you about updating your living trust or promises you a better return on your investment. Watch out. There are so many things called trust mill scams out there. This guy was the worst. In San Diego, I prosecuted him. He was called Jeffrey Milton. He formed a company called Capital Trust. He called himself a state charitable financial medical planning, over 25 years of service. He called himself a VP, a CSA, which is a certified senior advisor. All bogus. You can do anything you like on a business card. And then, worse than that, he created, through the IRS, a charity, 501c3 charity, which he called Senior Rescue. And he managed to use that to convince elderly people in San Diego County, over 35 of them, to invest money through his private annuity, where he was promising them a 6% return on their money. And then there's other investment frauds, such as fake gemstones. So during this volatile stock market, don't allow yourself or others to be given a pitch by somebody saying, hey, invest in oil, invest in gold. This is the greatest thing since sliced bread. Don't allow yourself to be guided by that. Here's a crook that I prosecuted who lived in a gated community in San Diego, who stole through fake gemstones from elderly investors. And we've seen a rise in the number of investment scams because of social isolation. And the pandemic has indeed made older adults more vulnerable to fraud. Now, take a good look at this guy. This guy operated within all the mega churches in Fort Worth and Dallas, Texas. His name was William Gallagher. He had a charming smile. He had white teeth. He had wonderful white hair. He had charisma. He used God. He used Christian text, scripture, Bible, you name it. And he infiltrated all these mega big churches. Older parishioners loved him. And when he started to pitch investments to them, they flocked to him. He stole, get ready for it, over $30 million from Christians within these churches. Is it possible that within your community, there's a William Gallagher lurking? Yep, it is. The trouble is, as Christians, sometimes we allow our guard to drop. And it's almost like we feel bad about being suspicious. No, we should be suspicious. We have to be cautious. And even though Scripture says about opening our doors and entertaining angels unaware, I don't think we should be doing that anymore. I don't think we should be opening our doors to whomever that we don't know, because I think it creates added risks. So remember this one, William Gallagher, an absolute awful crook. Don't give to a charity that calls you or solicits you. They may say, we're from the police foundation, we're from the firefighters fund. Only give to a charity that you contact, but don't be allowed to give your credit card number. You may be thinking you're giving a one-off donation, but you know what happens? They will turn that into a monthly recycling. If you don't keep checking your credit card statement, it could amass lots of different monies. There's lots of bogus charities out there. And even legitimate charities use questionable tactics. So be very careful who you give money to. And if you're considering recommending somebody be made a conservator or guardian over an elderly person whose judgment is being questioned, be very careful. You may want to read this very important article called How the Elderly Lose Their Rights. You can Google it. You just type in How the Elderly Lose Their Rights. It's from the New Yorker magazine from 2017. It's a fascinating read. It's a scary read, but it's all based upon a real case out of Las Vegas, Nevada. You may also want to watch a documentary called The Guardians, again, based upon this real case out of Nevada. It's called April Parks. She was a court-appointed professional fiduciary who knew how to work around the system enough under the radar to steal her clients' money. And she used her position to steal lots of money from elderly clients. So be very cautious when choosing or even discussing appointing a guardian or a conservator. Do your research. And then what happens if you receive an email indicating that your subscription has been auto-renewed? I just got one today. Sometimes you get emails like this from the Geek Squad, and you go, wait a minute, I didn't do that. And so you're tempted to call the number in the email. Don't do it. Just delete it. It's fake. Or from Norton LifeLock telling you you've auto-renewed. You go, no, I didn't. I'm not spending $315 on this. I'll call that number. No, don't call it. This is all a big scam. Delete it. And what about something we call smishing? So a text that I received on my smartphone recently, and maybe you've also had this same text. Now, if you got this text for a minute, would you believe it was genuine? You probably would. But it's not. The US Post Office never does this. Amazon never does this. This is only done by fraudsters and crooks. So again, please warn everyone you can come into contact with that this is fake. So what do? If you think that somebody you know within your family, in your street, may be a victim of elder abuse, maybe you're concerned now about your elderly neighbor whose son lives with her, and you hear shouting going on every night. Or you know of somebody within your family who may be a victim of financial exploitation, but is too embarrassed to say anything. What do? You call your local adult protective services. But if the situation is life-threatening, is urgent, then obviously don't hesitate to call the police or your local sheriff. And in addition to any other resources that Sean or Laura has put up there on the chat box, feel free to reach out to AARP's Fraud Watch Network. You do not have to be a member to take advantage of this phenomenal resource. Remember the lady that I introduced you to, Kate Kleinert, who now works for AARP. When she discovered she was a victim, eventually she was persuaded to call the police. Unfortunately, the police said, "Why are you calling us? This is not a crime." Now, the police were wrong to say that because it is a crime. They mistook the consensual nature of the transfer of assets to being non-criminal. No, Kate was defrauded, but she got help from calling AARP Fraud Watch Network. So they have a wonderful access to resources. So please make sure that folks take advantage of that as well. I always have a message for older adults, one of respect, one of commitment. And I like to use, and I used to use this all the time in closing arguments in trial. I used to try to summarize the theme of my trial and the evidence with 3 words that began with the same letter. I like the letter P because my name's Paul. I used to be a prosecutor. So I talk about passion, I talk about purpose, and I talk about perseverance. And when we apply these 3 qualities, it's amazing what we can do. So my final message is one that my late father gave me before he got Alzheimer's. And he was a man who had an amazing sense of humor. And he called me one day and said, "Paul, your mother and I want you to be the first to know that we've just booked our first ski vacation." I said, "Dad, Mom doesn't need to learn skiing at her age. That's too risky." I fell for it. And he said, "You don't know what we mean by a ski vacation." He said, "The word ski, spend kids' inheritance." And he wanted me to know that they had just booked their 29th cruise. But this time it was on the concierge deck with a butler. And this was money that my sister and I would never, ever see because my parents were going to be a little extravagant. And I was thrilled about that. And so the message I always have for older adults is, look, you've worked long and hard for your money. Don't feel guilty about spending some money on yourselves. But if you have children and they don't have any special needs, you make sure that you tell them that you're taking a skiing vacation so they know that. Just here, take my contact information.
If there's any follow-up you'd like me to do with you, I'd be more than happy. If you'd like me to ever do a webinar for any organization that you're part of, feel free.
Great. And thank you. And everyone, please remember the World Elder Abuse Day will be on the 15th of June. There are many activities. If you Google it, you can tune in to a variety of events that are happening around the world to help protect seniors. So thanks again, Paul.